In this lesson, we want to turn our attention to SharePoint service applications. Now, one of the things that I want to mention right up front is that my goal here is not to talk about specifics of certain service applications. Now, one of the things that you're going to notice about service applications is sort of like a snowflake. No two are alike. That while there's going to be a lot of commonality, a lot of common ground, and a lot of different things that our service applications are going to share in common, you are going to notice that there's going to be a lot of differences between them as well. However, the underlying architecture and the basic concepts are going to be the same. So before we start delving into specific service applications later on in the course, it behooves us to stop and take a look at the architecture that's going to make the magic of SharePoint service applications work. Now, all of this begs the question right up front of exactly what is a service application and why are service applications so important to our SharePoint implementation. Well, the first big thing that a service application gives us the ability to do is to have that service application be centralized. So that way, I set up the service application one time, and I can have multiple web applications, or potentially even multiple farms, point to that one service application. So for example, when we're talking about something like manage metadata, which gives us the ability to centralize a series of hierarchical keywords, we can have all of those keywords in one centralized database that multiple applications and even multiple farms can have the ability to point to. It also gives us the ability to manage and minimize performance overhead. Now, what we can do is choose which servers are going to be running the underlying services for our service applications. So that way, ones that maybe aren't incurring a whole lot of overhead, maybe ones that we're not using very heavily, could be grouped together on one server, and then others, like search for example, that are going to incur quite a bit of overhead and certainly going to be used by the vast majority of my users, can be run on dedicated servers. Now you're going to notice that SharePoint supports and provides a whole host of different service applications. Now, one of the big things that I do want to mention here is that the service applications that you're going to have available to you are going to vary based on the version of SharePoint that you are installing. Now, I've got the list on the next two slides of all the different service applications. A couple of the ones that I want to call out are access services, which actually gives us the ability to publish an access database into SharePoint and have that be available as a site. We've got business data connectivity service, which gives us the ability to better incorporate external data, say from a SQL server, and have that appear almost as if it was inside of SharePoint. We have machine translation service, which will give us the ability to actually have SharePoint assist us in automatic translation. We've got manage metadata, which will have a centralized database of keywords. And then our search service, which is going to be, of course, about managing and working with search. Beyond that, we've got our secure store service, which will give us the ability to have a collection of usernames and passwords in one location that can be mapped up to different users. We've got our user profile service application, which will have our user profiles and also handle syncing information about our users from databases like Active Directory or maybe any other third-party application that we might have. And then finally, word automation services, which basically gives us the print menu available inside of an API. So that way, if you need to do things like automatically export Word documents to, say, XPS, you can do that by utilizing the word automation services. Now, what you're going to notice about our service applications is that there's a lot of different moving parts, a lot of different components that make the magic happen. Down at the very bottom, you're going to notice that each service application will have a Windows service. Now, there's only going to be one service regardless of the number of different implementations that we might have inside of that farm for that service application. The flexibility here is that if I need multiple instances of, for example, search, I can do that without having to launch multiple services. So it's always going to be simply one service behind the scenes. On top of that, then, is the service application. Now, the service application is going to be the instance of the service application. Now, the way that our service applications are going to be connected to by our web applications is through what's known as a service application connection or a proxy. Now, one of the things that I want to mention about our service applications proxy is the fact that, for the most part, we really don't have to manage that. The reason is that SharePoint will automatically create that for us when we create the service application. And really, unless you're getting into PowerShell to create connections between web applications and SharePoint, you really don't have to worry about the service application connections. And then finally, last but not least, is our web applications. And what you're going to notice with our web applications is that our web applications will connect up to, eventually, our service applications, and multiple web applications can use the exact same service application. And this is one of the great advantages to service applications. Again, like I mentioned before, this gives us that ability to create, configure, set it up one time, and have multiple web applications be able to take advantage of that implementation. I mentioned at the outset that one of the very big things about our service applications is the fact that there's going to be a lot of commonality, but an awful lot of differences. That everything that we just mentioned as far as the setup goes, our web application pointing down to our connection, pointing down to our service application, pointing down to the service, is going to be consistent. After that, however, everything is going to wind up changing. Typically, each service application that I'm going to create needs an application pool. Now, the application pool, as we've already discussed, is going to be a separate memory space and a separate account. Now, the nice part about that is it allows me to separate those for potentially security or stability reasons. But one of the very big things to keep in mind is that each time that I create an application pool, all the DLLs that are needed to run whatever applications are running inside of there need to be loaded up. So as a result, the more application pools that I create, the more that I'm going to wind up degrading performance. So generally speaking, it's best to group your service applications together into a single or into very few application pools. The next thing that most service applications are going to have is at least one database. Now, the database, or databases, are going to be used by the service application for storing whatever data it is that it might need. Now, as far as how big those databases are going to get, the sizing of them, the performance overhead, all of that's going to vary based on the service application. One important thing to note is the fact that any time that we need to tell SharePoint where to put some data, we always get the opportunity to specify a different server. So if, again, for performance purposes, I want to have the ability to put different databases onto different servers, I have that level of flexibility. Finally, last but not least, most, but again, not all, service applications will have some configuration interface. And that configuration interface will allow you to go in and provide whatever settings it is that you might need. Now again, depending on the service application, that application or that interface is going to vary, and it's actually even possible that there might not even be a configuration interface whatsoever, that just simply creating the service application is all that needs to be done. We mentioned our application pools. Application pools need to have credentials. SharePoint wants to manage those credentials. And it's going to do this through what's known as a managed account. Now, why does SharePoint want to be able to manage these credentials? Well, the big reason that it wants to be able to manage the credentials is, of course, SharePoint is built to be a farm. And my farm, of course, is going to have multiple services, or servers rather. And on each server, I have the ability to stop and start different services. So as I stop and start different services, all the application pools that are going to be used to run that service need a username and password. They need credentials. And so if I'm having to run around to each server on the farm and punch in new usernames and new passwords to keep all that up to date, well, that's really just going to make my life more difficult. On top of that, especially during the initial configuration of SharePoint, I'm going to be setting up a lot of different service applications and potentially multiple application pools. And I don't want to constantly be typing in usernames and passwords. I've got better things to do with my time. So to help us out, the managed accounts will also securely store the username and password inside of SharePoint. So that way, after we create the managed account, all that I have to do is simply choose the account from the drop-down list, and SharePoint will automatically have the password available for me. Now, some organizations have password expiration policies, and some organizations extend those password expiration policies to service accounts as well. If you've never had to manage that, well, it's as difficult as it sounds, because I'm having to now run around, change the password, and all the different spots that are using that account, I'm then having to go in and update the password there and restart those services. Needless to say, that's not fun. Fortunately, one of the coolest features of managed accounts is the ability for SharePoint to automatically handle the password expiration for me. So that way, all that I have to do is just simply tell SharePoint, hey, there's a password expiration policy, and let SharePoint do its thing. And what's cool is that SharePoint will automatically detect what that password policy happens to be and make sure that it's always in compliance. So to quote a late night infomercial, it winds up being set it and forget it. Now, to create a managed account, there's a couple of different ways that we can do this. One way that we can do this, of course, is by using central administration, going to security, manage accounts, and then punching in the username, the password, and the expiration settings. We can also do this inside of PowerShell. Now, to do it inside of PowerShell, there's a couple of different steps that what we wind up having to do is we wind up having to create what's known as a credential, which is really just simply a username and a password. And then we pass that username and a password, that credential, into the new SP Managed Account commandlet. Let's take a look at how we can create and work with our managed accounts. So let me start off by firing up central administration here. And I'm going to head on over to security and then to my managed accounts. Now, all I have to do to create a brand new managed account is just simply click register managed account, specify my username. So we'll say geektrainer/SP2013 service, which, by the way, is a basic account that I created inside of my domain. Just gave it a very clever name of SP2013 for SharePoint 2013 service. And then my super duper top secret password. And then at this point, all I normally have to do is just simply hit OK. But you'll also notice that, as promised, I have the ability to manage expiration as well. And all that I have to do is just simply put a little check next to enable automatic password change, and basically just let it do its thing from there. And you'll even notice that if I put the little check to light this up, that it can even email me when it's changed the password. That's pretty slick. In my case, however, I don't have password policy enabled, or the expiration policy enabled, so I'm just going to clear that out. I'm going to hit OK, and voila, I've got my brand new managed account. Now, for demo's sake here, I'm going to go ahead and delete that, and I'm going to go in and create the account through PowerShell. So back to the Start menu, and let's go to SharePoint 2013 Management Shell, and let's take a look at our steps. So as I mentioned before, we need to create a credential, and our credential is going to be a username and a password. So to make things a little bit easier to read, I'm going to break this down into two separate steps here. So let's go ahead and set up our username. Username equals Geek Trainer /SP 2013 service, and I'm going to hit enter. The next thing that I need is my password. Now, the password is required to be a secure string, meaning that it's going to be available to PowerShell, and that once we close everything out, it'll be guaranteed to be cleaned out of memory. Now, in order for me to create the secure string, I need to call convert to secure string, specify my password. By the way, your security tip for the day is that, generally speaking, typing out a password on a screen that's being recorded is a bad idea. Just a little tip from me to you. All right, all kidding aside there, I do have to tell it that it is coming in as plain text, and I do have to call force, which is basically just again saying that, yes, I'm okay with the fact that that's coming in as plain text. And I'm going to hit OK, or hit enter rather, and now I've got my little password. The next thing that I need is my credential, and I'm going to do that by creating a new PowerShell object, and this is going to be System Management Automation PS Credential, and what this needs is my username and my password. And that is the credential that the new SP Managed Account commandlet needs. So let's go ahead and call new SP Managed Account, pass in my credential, hit enter, and sure enough, it comes back with the information about my credential. And if I bring back up Central Administration and I hit refresh, what you're going to notice is that sure enough, it's got my little service account. Cool, cool, cool. So now it's time to turn our attention to actually creating our service applications. Now, as always, we can do this inside of Central Administration. And what you're going to do is you're going to go to Manage Web Applications, Service Applications, and then from inside of there, you're going to choose New, and then Service Application. On the flip side, if you're going to be doing this through PowerShell, well, again, service applications are the snowflakes of SharePoint. No two are alike. And so the big thing that you're going to notice is that there is no single new SP service application commandlet. That there's basically one for each service application that you might be creating. Now, about the only thing that you're typically going to have is the ability to give it a name. You might have the ability to give it an application pool, and pretty much from that point forward, the switches are going to vary based on the service application. Now, fortunately, most service applications can be created through Central Administration. However, there are a couple that can only be created from PowerShell, and the big one, and this is the one that I'm going to be demoing in just a couple of moments, is the state service. Now, the state service is used because of the fact that HTTP is stateless, and that each time a request is made and we send down the response, we disconnect and we forget who that user is. So the state service writes the information off to a database, so that way we can maintain that information across multiple round trips. Let's take a look at creating our service applications. I'm going to go back to my Start menu, and I'm going to go to Central Administration here. And over on the left-hand side, I'm going to choose Application Management. Now, I could also click Application Management there, or I could also click on Manage Service Applications as well. All of them will take me to the exact same spot. That you'll notice if I click on Application Management, that from inside of here, I have my Manage Service Applications. So if I click that, now what you're going to notice is that I've got my list of service applications. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click New. And then I get my list of available service applications. Now, I'm going to choose the Secure Store service. The screen that you're going to see here is going to vary wildly depending on the service application that you're configuring. Now again, typically you'll have a name. Typically it'll ask you about at least one database. Typically it's going to ask you about at least one application pool. But again, all of that's going to vary depending on the service application in question. Now in our case with the Secure Store, this is a pretty typical setup screen. That it's going to ask me for my name, Secure Store. It's going to ask me for the database server. And then it's going to ask me for the name of the database. And I'm going to say SharePoint _ Secure Store. Now, whenever you're creating databases, one of the little best practices is to make sure that you have a naming convention. So that way, if I'm the DBA and the server has databases not just from SharePoint but from other applications, I can very quickly identify which the SharePoint databases are just by simply looking at the names. It makes my life as a DBA that much easier. So now, it'll ask me about how it is that it's going to authenticate. If we choose Windows authentication, then it's going to utilize the application pool's identity to connect. You'll also notice that it's going to ask us about the failover database server. That's only needed if we're using mirroring, and that's just going to be for the mirror server. And then you're going to notice it's going to ask about our application pool. Now, since this is the first service application that I'm creating, I'm going to let SharePoint create my application pool for me. If I wanted to use one that was already in existence, I would just simply put the dot next to Use Existing Application Pool, hit the drop-down, choose the one that I want. But in my case, I'm going to create a brand new one. I'm going to say SharePoint. We'll say Web Services. And then down below, you're going to notice that we've got our drop-down list with our managed accounts. And there is the SP 2013 service account that we created earlier. So I'm going to choose that, and then I'm going to scroll down. And now in this case, what you're going to notice is Enable Audit. Enable Audit is specifically for the Secure Store service. One of the things about the Secure Store is that it's responsible for mapping usernames or groups to different logins, different users, for access to external systems. So if I have a web part, for example, that's connecting to Oracle, and I don't want my users to have to punch in a different username and password, then what I could do when I built that web part is I could build it to use the Secure Store. And then somebody could go in to that Secure Store and specify that if you're in this group, or if you are this user, that we're going to map you to this Oracle login. And so what the audit log is going to do for me is it's going to audit basically every call to that secure store. So that way we have that for security purposes. Now I'm just going to leave it with the default. Voila, we're now done. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click OK. Now what you're going to notice is that it lists my secure store. Now one of the little tricky things about this interface here is that even though it doesn't really look like it, this interface is two-phased. That there's two different ways that I can interact with most service applications. One way is by clicking to the side, bringing the ribbon to life, and then clicking on the different options on the ribbon. The other way that I can do it is by clicking on the link itself. Now, clicking on the link itself will take me to the Manage screen. Now, again, the Manage screen that you're going to see is going to vary depending on the service application. Now, I'm going to click on Secure Store here, which will take me to the Manage screen. And you're going to notice that I'm going to get an error message. The reason that I'm getting an error message goes back to that slide that we saw before about the web application pointing down to the service application connection, pointing down to the service application, pointing down to the service. Underneath it all, there is a Windows service that's required to be started. And we can do this by utilizing, well, both central administration as well as PowerShell. Let's just do it inside of central administration. Now, what I would do is I would click on Application Management, and then what you're going to notice over here is that I've got Managed Services on Server. Now, as a real quick side note, you'll notice that I can get to the exact same screen by going to System Settings and Manage Services on Server. And then from inside of here, you'll notice that if I scroll on down, that my Secure Store service, even though we just created the service application, is not started. The reason is that SharePoint doesn't know what servers I want to be running that service, so it doesn't start it. I need to actually go in and hit Start. So let me hit Start. Let's make sure that it's started. Secure Store Service, started. Excellent. Now I'm going to scroll back up. And now I'm going to go back into my Application Management. I'm going to go back to Manage Service Applications. And I'm going to click again on the Secure Store link. And what you're going to notice is I'm now getting an error message, but it's a different error message. What I want you to notice about this error message is that it just simply tells me before creating a Secure Store target application, I must first generate a new key for this Secure Store service application. Now, again, like I was saying before, what's going to happen on this screen is going to vary. I do need to start the underlying service for the service application. That's always going to be the case. And then I need to go in and configure the service application, and that's exactly what this screen is telling me to do, is it's now saying, hey Christopher, it's now time to configure the Secure Store service application. Now, like I said, my goal here is really to talk about service applications in general, so I'm not worried about the specifics to the Secure Store. But I do want to go back and take a look at one last little thing here. I'm going to go back to my Application Management. I'm going to go back to my service applications, and I'm again going to click to the right side of my Secure Store. And what you're going to notice is that I have an administrator screen. And if I click on administrators, what this would allow me to do is this would allow me to choose different people to administer this service application. This is yet another great advantage of service applications, is that I can delegate control. So that way, if I don't want to have to be the one responsible for punching in the usernames and passwords, or otherwise managing the Secure Store, I can pass control off to somebody else. And all that I would have to do here is just specify the username and password, click Add, and then down below, let's go ahead and just type in domain admins, for example, and let's hit Add. And then what you're going to notice is that down below, I get my permissions. Now, the permissions that you're going to see here are going to again vary based on the service application. So in the case of the secure store, you're going to notice that I could give somebody full control. I could give somebody the ability to manage applications. I could give somebody the ability to create them. I could give somebody the ability to delete them. So again, I have the ability to delegate control here. Let's take a look at the other side of the equation. Let's take a look at how to do this from PowerShell. So again, back to the Start menu, Management Shell, and I'm going to say CD /, and again CLS. Now, what I want to do here is I want to take a look at how to create the state service, because this is something that needs to be done on every farm. And I'm going to do this by creating a new variable, state service, and setting that equal to new SP state service application, and I'm going to give this a very creative name of state service. Now, the reason that I'm creating the new object is because I'm now responsible for creating the database and the application proxy. The state service, by the way, doesn't need an application pool. Just needs a database and the proxy. So to create the database, it's new SP state service database. Give it a name, Sharepoint state service, and specify the service application. And that's going to be that state service that we created a second ago. Voila, there's our database. Next up is we need to create the proxy. New SP state service application proxy. We'll give this a name. And again, I'm being very creative, state service. And we'll go ahead and specify the service application. And that's going to be our state service. And then finally, last but not least, is I'm going to add this to what's known as the default proxy group. Just simply meaning that every time that I create a web application, that web application will automatically point to this service application. So now I'm going to hit enter, and voila, it's now created that proxy. And we can see this if we go back to Central Administration, and we click on Manage Service Applications, and you'll notice right down there at the very bottom is our state service. Now I want you to notice that when I click to the side of it to select it, that nothing happened on the ribbon. Delete highlighted, but that's really it. And you'll also notice that when I go to click on this, that I can't. That there actually is no interface here. And this is sort of the point that I've been making, that every single service application is going to be a little bit different. Some of them are going to have UIs, some of them aren't. The ones that do have UIs, they're going to ask me for different things, provide me different ways of delegating control, provide me different ways of interacting with it based on that particular service application. There's the basics of service applications, and I'm going to see you in the next lesson.